Retrieve query parameters in a Spring Boot controller. Introduction. In web applications, query parameters are used to send additional data in the URL. For example, http://localhost 8080 API users name equals John and age equals 25. In this URL, name equals John, age equals 25 are query parameters. In Spring Boot, retrieving these query parameters inside a controller is a very common task. It is used in search, APIs, filtering data, pagination sorting, dynamic queries. Understanding how to retrieve query parameters is essential for building REST APIs. What are query parameters? Query parameters are key value pairs appended to a URL after a question mark. In simple terms, query parameters equals data passed in URL to customize request. Example: API products equals category equals electronics and price equals 1000. Example concept: URL means query parameters means controller receives values. Why this is important. Query parameters allow clients, front-end mobile apps APIs to send dynamic data. For example, filter users by name, search products by category, paginate results, sort data. Example concept: client sends request, means controller reads parameters, means returns filtered result. Without query parameters, APIs would be static and less flexible. Basic way, using @request param. The most common way to retrieve query parameters in Spring Boot is using @request param. Example: import org spring framework.web.bin.annotation. @rest controller @request mapping API public class user controller get mapping user public string get user request param string name return username is plus name request get API/user question name John output username is John. Example concept: URL parameter means @request param means method argument. How it works: when Spring Boot receives a request, API username John, Spring automatically reads name equals John, maps it to the method parameter, injects the value into the method. Example flow: HTTP request means Spring parses query, means binds to parameter, means method executes multiple query parameters. You can retrieve multiple parameters easily. Example: @getMapping/user, public string get user, request param string name, request param int age, return name plus name plus name, age plus age, request API user name equals John and age 25. Output name John, age 25. Example concept: multiple query params means multiple @request param optional query parameters. By default, @request param is required. If the parameter is missing, Spring throws an error to make it optional. Example get mapping user, public string get user, request param required a false, string name, return username is plus name. Now this works. API user. Example concept: optional param means maybe null if not provided default values. You can provide a default value if the parameter is missing. Example: @getMapping user, public string get user, @request param default value guest, string name, return username is plus name, request API user, output username is guest. Example concept: missing param means default value used, different data types. Spring automatically converts query parameters to required types. Example: @getMapping product, public string get product, @request param string name, @request param int quantity, @request param double price. Return name plus, comma, plus, quantity, plus, price. Example concept: string means int means double, means auto-conversion by Spring, using @request param with different names. If the URL parameter name is different from the variable name, example @getMapping user, public string get user @request param username string name, return username is plus name, request/API/user, username equals John. Example concept. URL param name equals variable name means use @request param name, using map to get all parameters if you don't know all parameters in advance. Example. @getMapping. Params. Public map string string. Get all params. Request param, map string string params, return params. Request API params. Name equals John and age equals 25, and city Toronto. Output, name John, age 25. Example concept. All query params means map string string using multi-value map for multiple values. Sometimes a parameter can appear multiple times. API users, role equals admin and role equals user. Example import, org.springframework.util multi-value map. Get mapping, users. Public multi-value map string string, get users @request param multi-value map string string, params. Example concept. Same key multiple times means multi-value map using @model attribute. Advanced. For many parameters, you can map them to an object. Example DTO, public class user filter, private string name, private int age. Getters and setters. Controller, @getMapping, user. Public user filter, get user. Model attribute user filter filter. Return filter. Request API, user. Name John and age equal 25. Example concept. Query params means object fields means model attribute. This is useful for complex filtering. Real-world example, search API, @getMapping/search, public string search, request param required equals false, string keyword, @request param default value 1, int page, request param default value 10, int size, return keyword plus page plus size. Example request. API search, keyword equals laptop, page 2 and size 20. Example concept. Search API means query params means dynamic response. Difference. Query param versus path variable. Query param API user comma name a pathin, @request param string name. Path variable API user John, @path variable string name. Example concept. Query param means optional filter path. Variable means required resource identifier. Common errors. 1. Missing required parameter @request param. If request API user. Error. Required request parameter name is not present too. Type mismatch @request param int age. Request API user age equal ABC. Error. Failed to convert value 3. Wrong parameter name @request param string name. Request API user username John. Result. Error or null. Best practices. Best practices include: use @request param for simple parameters. Use required equals false for optional inputs. Use default value when needed. Validate inputs if necessary. Use DTO @model attribute for complex queries. Use multi-value map for repeated parameters. Example concept. Clean parameter handling means better API design advantages. Advantages include simple and clean syntax, automatic type conversion, flexible API design, supports optional and default values, integrates easily with Spring MVC challenges. Challenges include handling missing parameters, dealing with type conversion errors, managing many parameters, validating user input. By learning this topic, you understand what query parameters are, how to use @request param, how to handle optional parameters, how to use default values, how to map parameters to objects, how to handle multiple values, difference between query params and path variables. Simple definition. Retrieve query parameters in Spring Boot. The process of extracting key value pairs from the URL using annotations like @request param and mapping them to method arguments in a controller. Final summary. Query parameters are a fundamental part of REST API design in Spring Boot. They allow clients to pass dynamic data through the URL. The most common way to retrieve them is using @request_param, which automatically maps query parameters to method arguments. Spring Boot also provides flexible options such as optional parameters, default values, mapping to objects, handling multiple values. Understanding this concept allows you to build powerful APIs for filtering, searching, pagination, and dynamic data handling.